They say there are nights when the sky seems heavier, as if an ancient sadness had descended upon the earth. That night was one of them. There was no storm, but the wind blew with a strange density, laden with foreboding. In a small, forgotten chapel on the side of a road, a woman lit a candle in front of an image of the Virgin Mary. She did so with trembling hands, as if her soul knew something was about to begin. That simple, carved wooden image had remained there for more than 70 years. Many said it was miraculous, others claimed it was merely a local legend. But that night, as the clock struck 3 a.m., the candle flame flickered brightly, and a drop, as pure as a tear, fell from the Virgin's face. First one, then another, and then a silent cry flooded the figure. The few who saw her couldn't believe it. Some fled, others fell to their knees. The air became heavy, the church bells rang untouched, and a murmur ran through the village. The Virgin is crying. And it's not for us. It's for what's coming. Within hours, the news spread. Local media outlets attempted to capture the phenomenon, but their cameras mysteriously shut off as they approached. One journalist, one of the few who managed to record a few seconds, swore he heard a female voice whispering, "My crying isn't a miracle, it's a warning." And that's when the signs began. In different parts of the world, images of the Virgin Mary began to weep at the same time. In New Orleans, a statue in an old church was covered in salty drops pouring from its eyes. In a family home in Texas, a mother claimed that the image she kept by her window began to emit a faint glow, just before a strong earthquake shook the ground. Experts tried to explain it with scientific reasons, but no one could deny the synchronicity. The tears fell at exactly the same time in different countries. It wasn't a local phenomenon, it was a global one. Meanwhile, in a small convent outside Philadelphia, a nun named Clara began receiving messages during prayer. They weren't her own thoughts, she knew. They were clear, gentle phrases, but charged with a heartbreaking urgency. One of them chilled her soul. "In 72 hours, the world will be tested." Clara wrote everything in her diary, little imagining that those words would later spread across the continent. The most disturbing thing was what followed. Heaven does not punish. Man destroys himself. But when the mother's tears touch the earth, it means the limit has been crossed. The hours passed slowly, but the feeling of imminence became unbearable. People in different parts of the country began to dream of the same symbol, an open window, light coming in, and a voice saying, "Place this on your window before you sleep." No one understood what this meant. Some thought it was a candle, others a crucifix, others simply an act of faith. But that same night, the phone lines at the convents and churches became jammed. Some claimed that by placing a blessed candle in the window, an inexplicable peace would envelop the house. Others, however, claimed that if they didn't, something dark would appear near the walls, as if an invisible presence were surrounding them. Tensions mounted. Families began gathering to pray, social media filled with testimonies, and the wailing in the images continued, persistent, unstoppable, as if pleading for attention from heaven. The Vatican remained silent. No one confirmed or denied the facts, but in inner circles within the church, it was said that an ancient document had been discovered, one that spoke of the weeping of the last days. According to this text, when the tears of heaven mingled with the earth, 3 days of darkness would cover the world. And although no one wanted to believe it, something deep within each soul began to recognize the truth. It wasn't just a religious phenomenon, it was a message, and the words 72 hours were repeated like an unstoppable echo. People began to look at their watches in fear, counting the minutes, wondering if the warning had already begun. And in that fear-filled silence, a blue light crossed the night sky, visible from Florida to California. It wasn't a meteorite, nor a satellite. The radars didn't record anything, but witnesses agree that light was human-shaped, and it seemed to be crying. That bluish light remained suspended in the sky for almost 3 minutes. It emitted no noise, no spark, no smoke, but its brilliance pierced the trees, the roofs, and the bodies, as if it were passing through matter itself. The people who saw it described an unforgettable sensation, a mixture of peace and terror, as if a sacred presence manifested in a world that had already forgotten how to kneel. On the streets, people raised their phones, but the screens went black. In homes, clocks stopped briefly, and animals began acting erratically. On the Gulf Coast, fishermen claimed to have seen the reflection of that light in the water, and one of them swore that a female figure was walking on the waves, tears falling into the sea, making it shine like crystal. Hours later, social media exploded. Thousands of blurry videos showed the same image from different states, a silhouette of light slowly descending toward Earth. No one knew exactly where it had fallen, but the coordinates coincided on one point, a wooded area in northern Tennessee. The next morning, a group of pilgrims headed to the site. Upon arrival, they found something no human being had ever seen before. The ground was completely dry, as if the dew had evaporated. In the center, a circle of shining earth gave off a faint scent of incense. There were no traces of fire, no ash, no remnants of anything earthly. Only that perfect footprint, and at its edge, a small, half-buried wooden cross with a hand-carved inscription, "Weeping is the language of heaven." The group knelt. Some wept without understanding why. Others prayed, fearing what might come. It was then that one of them, an old man named Matthew, said he had heard a voice coming from the wind, a feminine voice, sweet but firm. The time is fulfilled. There is still hope, but the world has forgotten to listen. From that moment on, the coincidences multiplied. In churches in California, Georgia, and New York, priests began receiving strange confessions. People claimed to have dreamed of a window that opened by itself during the night, letting in a blue light that illuminated the room. In all the dreams, a female figure reached out and whispered, "Place this on your window before you sleep." No one knew exactly what he meant, but many began to imitate the gesture. They placed blessed candles, medals, holy cards, even small rosaries hanging from the glass. The strange thing was that in the houses where they did this, the temperature remained warm and the atmosphere became serene. But in places where the message was ignored, the nights were filled with inexplicable noises, shadows crossing the walls, and a metallic smell that seemed to float in the air. Meanwhile, at a monastery outside Boston, a cloistered sister named Lucia began compulsively writing in the wee hours of the morning. She didn't remember doing so, but her pages were filled with words that were not her own. The mother cries because her voice has not been heard. The warning is not to cause fear, but to awaken sleeping hearts. But the clock has already begun to tick down the last 72 hours. The text was leaked and fell into the hands of a well-known theologian who compared it to ancient prophecies of saints and seers. Everything fit together too well. The tears, the blue light, the words on the window. According to his studies, it was an exact repetition of a warning that had been written at Fatima but never made public. Governments began to worry. Space agencies scanned the sky for any astronomical phenomenon that might explain what had happened, but found nothing. Satellites detected no bodies or electromagnetic emissions. However, what was most disturbing was what they did find: a sudden decrease in the Earth's magnetic field just as light appeared. A cosmic silence impossible to explain. On a spiritual level, something was stirring. In hospitals, patients in comas began to cry for no reason. In prisons, some inmates claimed to have heard heavenly songs at midnight. And in ordinary homes, mothers and grandmothers recounted how the clock stopped every time they prayed the rosary at the window. It was then that an even more disturbing sign spread across the country: the water. In various cities, the water in some fountains began to take on a faint silvery hue. It wasn't pollution, it wasn't mineral water, it was a subtle sheen that disappeared upon contact with the hands. Analysis couldn't identify its source, but some believers claimed it was a reflection of the Virgin's tears. The media began calling it the 72-hour phenomenon. At first it was dismissed as a viral rumor, a religious hype. But as the hours passed, the phenomena increased. People heard chants in unknown languages, lights appeared over closed churches, and a collective sense of anticipation. It wasn't just fear, it was the certainty that something sacred and at the same time terrifying was about to be revealed. Religious authorities remained silent, but some priests began secretly preparing their communities. In a leaked audio recording, a bishop was heard saying, "Do not extinguish your faith even when darkness comes. If your house is in grace, do not fear. But place the sign in your window, for the angels will recognize those who wait." The phrase went viral. Put the sign in your window. Millions began doing so, without entirely knowing why, driven by an intuition that surpassed reason. Meanwhile, at the same spot where the light had descended over Tennessee, a group of researchers revisited the site. But this time, the ground was covered in ash. In the center, where the earth had once been bright, they found a single intact rose. It had no thorns, and on one of its petals, a message engraved with a trace of fire. "The night will be long, but whoever listens will see the dawn." The news leaked out quickly, and with it a sense of urgency that made even the most skeptical hearts tremble. The next few hours would not be like the ones before. Something was changing. Something was approaching. For the next 24 hours, the entire world began to feel an unease impossible to explain. It wasn't a common fear, but a deep vibration that seeped into thoughts, dreams, even silence. People looked at each other in the streets without saying a word, as if they all knew something invisible was watching them. The news began to cover unrelated stories, but united by an atmosphere of mystery. In Washington, a group of birds suddenly fell from the sky for no apparent reason. In Florida, the waves stopped for exactly 3 minutes, as if the entire ocean were holding its breath. In a small town in Kentucky, the clocks in every house struck 3:33 at the same time and then went off. That same night, millions of people reported having dreamed of the same scene: an open window, a cold breeze entering the room, and a voice saying, "Before darkness falls, place this on your window." Upon awakening, many found tears streaming down their faces. Others found the smell of incense in the air. No one knew where it was coming from. The image of the blue light continued to circulate online. But something new appeared, an anonymously submitted audio recording titled "The Voice of Heaven." In it, a woman could be heard weeping softly, followed by a phrase spoken with chilling calm: "My tears fall upon the earth, but few collect them. In 3 days, the veil will be lifted." Scientists declared the audio a hoax, but spectrum tests revealed frequencies impossible to generate by a human voice. Some said the sound contained a wave pattern similar to Gregorian chants mixed with old radio signals. Others, more skeptical, simply turned off their televisions and preferred not to think about it. However, something changed in the atmosphere. The nights began to take on a different color, a heavier tone, as if the darkness itself were alive. Children would wake up screaming, saying that a woman of light had visited them. In some cities, lamps would flicker at exactly 11:11 p.m., and a murmur seemed to run through the walls, repeating the same words: "She cries for what is coming." In a small Ohio convent, an elderly nun who had been blind for over 20 years regained her sight for a few minutes. She reported seeing the Virgin Mary dressed in white, standing by an open window. According to her testimony, the Virgin's face was covered with tears that fell like liquid pearls, and in her hand she held a piece of shining cloth, as if it were a heavenly veil. "Tell the world," the Virgin murmured, "to prepare its windows, for darkness will not enter where there is light." The local priests didn't know what to do. Some tried to keep their congregants calm, but others began to feel restless. The churches filled up, candles burned day and night, and the confessionals were overwhelmed. No one spoke openly of fear, but everyone knew something was brewing. On international news reports, tensions mounted. Analysts around the world began to speak of mass hysteria, but the phenomena continued to multiply. A reddish light appeared over the Nevada desert. In New York, the sky turned golden just before dawn, and in Chicago, the river was covered in a thin layer of luminous white foam, which disappeared before noon. Meanwhile, a group of believers decided to return to the place where it all began, in Tennessee. They wanted to pray, give thanks, or simply understand. But what they found took their breath away. The earth, where the thornless rose had stood, had now cracked. A faint steam rose from the cracks, and in the center, a whisper could be heard, almost imperceptible, as if someone were praying from deep within. One of the men recorded the sound and played it back in his car on the way back to the city. He sped up the audio and discovered something terrifying. The words were a prayer, a plea. It said, "Protect your children." The 3 days are already written. The fear began to become tangible. Religious goods stores emptied within hours. Rosaries, candles, medals, and statues disappeared from the shelves. News reports reported a collective spiritual panic. But in every interview, the same pattern was repeated. Ordinary people claiming something was calling them from within. They needed to do something, prepare, pray, put something in their window. It was then that a shocking event occurred in Philadelphia. At St. Michael's Parish, during evening mass, an image of the Virgin Mary began to weep. At first, the faithful thought it was condensation or moisture, but the tears were real. They fell from the statue's eyes and left a bluish glow on the ground. Later, analysis would reveal that it was not water, but a liquid with light particles, impossible to classify. The news spread like wildfire. Pilgrims filled the church, and the media began broadcasting live. Tears continued to flow, and the priest in charge could only manage one sentence before kneeling. "She is crying for us." From that night on, the signals intensified. Church bells rang alone at midnight. Some clocks began to tick backward, and televisions, even when turned off, reflected a blue light that came from no visible source. In the midst of it all, a message began to circulate among believers. The warning will come like a wind without a shadow. 3 days before, the heavens will shake and tears will be seen in the sun. Astronomers dismissed it as superstition, but 3 days later, just before sunset, the sun began to partially darken. It wasn't an eclipse, nor a storm. It was something more, a perfectly circular shadow that seemed to emerge from within the star itself. Within minutes, the entire world saw the same image, a ring of fire in the sky, and in its center, a shape that many interpreted as a face. Not everyone saw it the same way. Some said it was the face of a weeping woman, others that of a child with closed eyes, still others simply a living shadow. But what no one could deny was the feeling that invaded them, a mixture of regret, wonder, and fear. And it was there, at that precise moment, that the air changed. The wind began to blow from the north with a strange force, and a scent of incense and roses filled the streets. The birds stopped singing. The dogs began to howl. And such a profound calm descended upon the land that many believed time had stopped. The warning hadn't arrived yet, but everyone already felt it. The sky was breathing, and the whole world held its breath. The early hours of the following day were unlike any other. There was no birdsong or movement in the streets. Everything seemed suspended in an unearthly silence. In their homes, people woke up without understanding why. Their digital clocks flickered to an impossible time, 0000, without moving. Some tried to reset them, but the devices simply refused to work. It was then that the sounds began. An echo, soft at first, like a distant wind, swept across the skies from coast to coast. Windows rattled, leaves trembled, and a voice, not human, not mechanical, spread over the roofs and hearts. Not everyone heard it the same way. For some, it was a motherly voice, for others, a sad melody that seemed to come from the soul. But all understood the same message, spoken in a language no tongue could translate. Time is up. Prepare your light. In cities like Boston, Los Angeles, and New Orleans, people began to take to the streets searching for the source of that voice. The sky, still covered by the circular shadow from the day before, seemed to pulse. Silent lightning flashed across the firmament without any thunder, as if they were the pulses of a living presence. Millions of videos were uploaded online every minute. Some showed the sky turning violet, others columns of light descending in the midst of storms. But the most disturbing thing was what they all had in common, a female figure blurred in the glow. Her form was only briefly outlined, but in those seconds the hearts of those who saw her were filled with a mixture of tears and consolation. The newscasts tried to maintain calm, but the reality eluded any scientific explanation. Astronomers assured that the phenomenon was not atmospheric, that the sky was behaving as if it had consciousness. Churches opened their doors, and lines stretched for entire blocks. Priests no longer gave sermons. They wept alongside their faithful, repeating, "She's here, but she doesn't come to punish. She comes to warn." Meanwhile, in a small town in Texas, a woman named Eleanor claimed to have received a direct message. According to her account, the Virgin Mary appeared outside her window, enveloped in a glow so white she couldn't look directly at her. She said, "Tell them not to fear the coming darkness, but rather the silence of the heart that doesn't listen. The tears that fall from heaven are not punishment, they are a warning." Eleanor recorded a video with a trembling voice, holding a rosary. "She was crying," she said, "and the air smelled of flowers. She asked me to light a candle by your window tonight, because heaven will be looking down on us." The video reached millions of views in a matter of hours. People across the country began to do the same, placing candles, crucifixes, photographs, and small statues of Mary. Some families wrote messages on paper, "Protect us, Mother." But while faith was ignited in some, fear dominated others. On the streets, the lights flickered as if the electrical system was breathing. Cars stopped for no reason, phones lost signal, and an invisible murmur ran through the walls and ceilings, repeating one word: warning. At the Vatican, the cardinals held an emergency meeting. A sealed document was removed from the secret archive and read in a low voice by the Pope. His face changed color. Witnesses present claim that after the reading he only murmured, "So, heaven has finally spoken." The content of that text was never revealed, but a few hours later, the bells of St. Peter's rang out of schedule, something that hadn't happened since World War II. Scientists tried to maintain reason, but their instruments kept breaking down inexplicably. At NASA, space cameras captured an anomaly, an immense circular shadow moving between the Earth and the Sun. Its size was impossible to measure, but it extended beyond the satellite's field of view. They called it the Veil. In many parts of the country, a pressure began to be felt in the air, as if the oxygen were being depleted. People gasped for air, animals sought shelter, and the sky began to emit a strange glow, a mixture of red and gold that stung the eyes. It was as if day and night had decided to merge in a single instant. And just then, in the midst of that silent chaos, the sign appeared. A gigantic cross of light formed in the sky over the Gulf of Mexico. It didn't come from the sun, or clouds, or any visible source. It was a beam of pure, vibrant energy that stretched from the horizon to the highest part of the firmament. Thousands of people fell to their knees. Others wept without knowing why. In hospitals, prisons, schools, and homes, the same phenomenon was visible. and a strange, ephemeral peace settled over everyone. For an hour, the entire world was paralyzed by that symbol. Cameras broadcast it live. Planes halted their course. Clocks stopped again at 3:33, and a new voice resounded from the heavens, this time clearer, more human, closer. "My children, what you will see is not the end. It is the beginning of awakening. The tears that fall upon you are my pain for those who do not yet believe." Then the sky tore open. Literally, a luminous crack appeared right where the cross had been. It was like a shining wound opened in the vault of the firmament, and from it began to emanate a deep sound, a vibration that made the ground tremble. It wasn't noise, it was a living frequency, a calling. Some began to convulse, others entered a trance, and still others simply fainted. The animals fled in a stampede. The trees bowed as if in prayer. The sea, along the coasts, receded several meters, exposing its bottom for a few seconds. And then the wind blew with such force that it toppled everything that wasn't firm. But mysteriously, the houses with a candle or a sacred symbol in the window remained intact. Security cameras showed it. While the winds swept through entire streets, the lighted windows continued to shine, motionless, as if protected by an invisible hand. It was then that all of humanity understood that something divine was happening. It wasn't a mere coincidence. Heaven was giving unequivocal signs. The warning was on its way. However, what no one expected was what would come next, because the true miracle or the true judgment was not coming from heaven, but from within the soul of every human being. The night had grown denser. The wind beat against the windows with a sound that sounded like a distant lament, and the lights in the houses flickered as if an invisible force wanted to extinguish them. Maria, now sitting in her armchair, stared at the crucifix on the wall and felt a weight in her heart that she could not explain. She had received a warning, a vision so clear it had robbed her of sleep. In the next 3 days, hearts will be tested. These words resonated within her with the force of a divine echo, as if each letter were a drop of fire falling into her soul. She remembered the last time something like this had happened, a dream, many years ago, in which she saw a city bathed in red light and heard a chorus of voices praying in desperation. At the time, she hadn't understood. Now, everything seemed to align. It was as if heaven were repeating the same warning, only this time with urgency. As Maria prayed, her window began to vibrate. Outside, a shadow moved as if it had a form of its own. She slowly rose, rosary clutched between her fingers, and murmured, "Most Holy Mother, protect us." And it was at that moment that she felt something different, a gentle, luminous presence that invaded the room and dispelled the cold. A warm breeze blew over her face, and the scent of roses filled the air. It was her. The same voice she had heard before, sweet and full of pain, spoke again, but this time seemed closer. "My children, time is running out. The days will grow dark, and many will lose their faith, but he who remains in prayer will be covered by my mantle." Mary fell to her knees, tears streaming uncontrollably. The Virgin's presence was not merely spiritual, it was real, palpable, as if God's own love had descended to earth for a brief instant. A voz continuou, e cada palavra parecia atravessar o coração. "A great sign will be seen in heaven, and many will fear. But do not fear, for it is the awakening of sleeping souls. Before the purification there will be tears, but also hope." Maria wanted to ask what purification meant, but the voice slowly faded away, dissolving into a serene silence. Only the scent of roses remained. She understood then that she must warn, tell what she had heard. However, a doubt tormented her. How would people react? Who would believe that the Virgin had spoken to her? The next day, she decided to leave. The city was eerily quiet, as if everyone had awakened to the same premonition. The news spoke of unusual storms on the coast. mysterious sounds coming from the sky, and a blue glow seen by thousands the previous morning. Maria walked slowly, observing the fear in people's eyes, and something inside her told her that the spiritual clock had already begun ticking. In the square, she saw a group of people praying. She knelt beside them and began to pray the rosary. And it was at that moment that the church bell rang 3 times, though no one had pulled the rope. Everyone looked at each other in confusion, and an elderly man murmured, "It's a sign." Maria looked up at the sky and noticed a golden light forming between the clouds. It wasn't the sun. It was something purer, more alive, that seemed to pulse. Uma criança ao seu lado perguntou, "Es la Virgen?" Y María responderá con voz embargada, "Sí, hijo, es ella. Viene a recordarnos que todavía hay tiempo." But as people watched, the light began to fragment into small beams that fell slowly like soft flames, touching the ground and disappearing within seconds. And in the air, a phrase echoed, without a human voice, but audible in every heart. "Prepare your house, prepare your soul." The wind picked up, and an almost electric energy coursed through the city. Windows rattled, candles flickered, and Maria understood that this was only the first manifestation, the prelude of what was to come. And deep within his being, a new question began to burn. What will happen when the next 72 hours are up? Nothing seemed capable of stopping what had already been decreed, and the only thing left now was to keep listening, because the Virgin's next message was about to be revealed. Dawn arrived with a silence that seemed heavier than usual. There was no wind, not even the distant sound of cars. Everything was still, as if time had stopped for a moment. Maria woke with a start, her heart racing, with the feeling that something had awakened her. In her room, the candle flame beside the image of the Virgin flickered slightly, even though there was no draught. She got up, looked out the window, and saw in the distance a dense fog covering the streets, rising like a grey blanket. Suddenly, a deep rumble echoed in the sky. Not thunder, not a plane. It was a continuous deep rumble that made the ground vibrate. Maria put her hand to her chest and whispered, "It's starting." She felt the presence of something invisible moving through the air, as if the forces of good and evil were clashing. Meanwhile, news began to circulate. Emergency broadcasts spoke of strange lights seen over several American cities. In Dallas, Denver, Phoenix, the reports were identical: orbs of light, unexplained sounds, and a collective sense of fear. People went to their windows, some crying, others praying. Maria knew deep in her heart that all of this was part of the heavenly announcement. She knelt again before the image of the Virgin and began to pray the rosary fervently. Each Hail Mary was a plea, each sigh an attempt to understand what would come next. It was then that a soft light began to emanate from the window. The same scent of roses from the night before filled the room. Maria looked up and saw, again, the luminous figure before her. The Virgin was crying. Her tears fell like crystals and disappeared before the chime was played. Her voice was soft, but laden with gold. "My children, cry with me, because the world does not listen. I have warned, I have pleaded, and still the darkness advances. Many believe that love is weakness, but they do not know that without love the soul is lost." Mary was crying next to Ela. She wanted to say so many things, but her throat was still open. The Virgin continued, "In the coming hours the trials will be stronger. Do not be afraid when darkness covers the skies. Do not be afraid if the sounds from heaven shake your house. Place a blessed candle in your window, because where there is light, the enemy will not enter." The message sounded like a spiritual code, a divine instruction for times of turmoil. Maria ran to her desk, grabbed a pen and paper, and wrote it down word for word. The Virgin's light began to dim, but before disappearing she said, "Those who pray this night will save many souls, even without knowing it." Silence returned. Maria, her hands trembling, lit the candle and placed it in the window. The flame's reflection danced on the glass, and she noticed the air was different, denser, colder. Outside, strange sounds began to echo. A distant choir, voices that seemed to sing in ancient languages. Some people began to shout in the streets. Others fell to their knees, praying in despair. Mary knew it was time to choose, surrender to fear or remain firm in faith. She took a deep breath, grabbed her rosary, and began to pray aloud, using the words the Virgin had taught her. May the light of your sun dispel every shadow. May your mantle cover my house. May your love reign in the midst of the storm. As I prayed, a gentle force permeated the surroundings. The candles in the neighborhood began to light one by one, as if invisible hands were spreading light. And on the horizon, a red dawn began to appear, painting the sky with hues of blood and gold. Maria understood. This was not the end, but the beginning of the warning. The spiritual awakening Virgin had promised was manifesting. And as the lights danced in the sky, a new message began to form in her mind, not written, not spoken, but felt. Something greater was approaching, something that would forever change the way the world viewed the divine. And she knew that the coming night would reveal the secret heaven had kept for centuries. Dawn arrived slowly, tinging the horizon with hues of red and gold, colors that seemed vivid, almost pulsating. Every street, every house, every face reflected the intensity of the previous night. The shadows had receded, but fear still lingered, like a persistent fog. Maria knew that the true proof lay not in what the world had seen, but in what each heart had felt, for heaven's warning was deeper than any visible phenomenon. The Virgin Mary's presence manifested itself one last time, not only to her, but to all those who were attentive, who prayed, who remained steadfast. The light she emanated was not physical, but spiritual, penetrating walls, minds, and souls, reaching even those who had never believed. And in that light, a truth impossible to ignore was revealed. Every soul who chose faith over fear was protected. Every heart, hardened by selfishness and unbelief, would face the silence of its own choosing. Maria walked through the city streets, now silent and lit only by candles in the windows. Each flame was a sign of resistance, of hope. She could feel the pulsating energy of each prayer, each tear, each gesture of faith. The world had changed in a few hours, but the change came not from the sky or the clouds, but from the inner awakening that those hours of trial had provoked. The sky, still tinged with surreal colors, began to emit a frequency so subtle that few perceived it physically, but everyone felt it in their hearts. It was a vibration of mercy, warning, and love, all at once. The Virgin's voice reverberated one last time, firm and maternal. My children, everything you have seen is a reflection of what is happening within each of you. Light and shadow are not external enemies. They are internal choices. Hearts that have remained in prayer have opened the doors to eternal love. Those who ignored this warning will face the darkness they always carried within. The message could not be clearer. The true warning was not just a celestial phenomenon or visible signs. It was a direct call to the soul. And at the same time, it offered a promise. Those who open the eyes of the Spirit and surrender to the light will never be destroyed. As the first people poured into the streets, still stunned by what they had experienced, they noticed something impossible to explain. Small points of light began to descend from the sky, not burning, not consuming, but enveloping each being who had kept the faith. A sense of indescribable peace replaced fear. Some wept with relief, others fell to their knees in reverence, and many more simply breathed, feeling a direct connection to something greater than themselves. Maria, now at the center of everything, realized that the hooks that had unfolded during those 72 hours, the fear, the wind, the torn sky, the shadows, had served a single purpose: to awaken the heart of humanity. Heaven had not punished, but rather shown the fragility of humanity and the strength of faith. Every warning, every tear of the Virgin, every heavenly whisper was an opportunity to choose. She looked at the city, at the candles, at the faces filled with mingled emotion and fear. A sense of completeness filled her being. For the first time she understood the meaning of the expression, "The sky speaks, but the soul responds." And then, what had been tension, fear, and uncertainty turned into understanding and surrender. The world hadn't ended, but it had changed. Each person who had heard the warning felt they now carried a greater responsibility to keep the faith alive, share the message, protect those they loved, and above all, remember that the light never abandons those who seek it. Maria felt the Virgin's hands gently touch her shoulders, not with physical touch, but with presence. A deep peace enveloped her, and with a sigh that seemed to span centuries, the final voice said, "My children, the trial is over, but the journey continues. Keep the faith, protect your homes, listen to your heart. I will always be with you because my love never fails." The streets were now silent, but no longer empty of hope. People began to share their experiences, their miracles, their fears, and their revelations. Every gesture, every story was a continuation of the warning. Heaven had spoken, the world had listened, and humanity, for the first time in a long time, had felt the power of true faith. And so the final message became clear. It's not just about what comes from without, but about inner awakening. The prophecy is not about destruction, but about transformation, and every heart that chooses the light will be eternally protected. Maria looked to the horizon, and for the last time that morning saw the Virgin's figure disappearing into the light of the rising day, leaving only a feeling of love, peace, and constant alertness. She knew the experience would never be forgotten, and that, in the silence of every home, every lit candle, and every fervent prayer, the Virgin Mary's presence would live on, guiding, protecting, and reminding. The heavens speak, but it is the soul that must respond.